Welcome to Episode 7 of The Crisis, a day-by-day account of Britain's 1931 crisis, brought to you 90 years on. Friday, the 21st of August, 1931, would see another marathon meeting of the Labour cabinet and another conference with opposition leaders. Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald was desperately striving for a compromise in order to balance the budget while maintaining the support of all three parties so that his minority administration could survive. As it stood on the morning of the 21st of August, the cabinet had so far agreed to tax rises of £88.5 million and spending cuts of £56.25 million. The opposition parties deemed the cuts totally inadequate and in particular saw a cut in the rate of unemployment benefit, the government's biggest cost, as necessary. On the other hand, there was considerable disquiet in the Labour Party about cuts, and the TUC had come out against any cuts whatsoever. The Labour government appeared trapped, needing to come up with deeper cuts if it wished to get its programme through Parliament, but facing intransigent opposition from their own movement to such a course. As discussed in the last episode, the meetings of the 20th of August had laid the foundations for an essentially philosophical split in the Labour Party. Foreign Secretary and Party Manager Arthur Henderson had realized the ferocity of opposition to an austerity package in the wider Labour movement. He believed the cuts were necessary to save the pound, but had now come to the conclusion that if a Labour government were the ones who would slash the benefits and services of the most needy, the very people the party was founded to represent, it would compromise their principles and fatally split the party leadership from the rank and file, and, crucially, from the trade unions which provided so much of Labour's grassroots support and money. All of Henderson's instincts told him it was wrong to victimize those who had already fallen victim to the Depression by losing their jobs. To carry out such a program would mean the end of the Labour Party in its current form, the end of the alliance between socialists and trade unionists that had come together when the party was founded in 1900. Therefore, for Henderson, the issue now was to save the Labour Party. They should put forward the £56 million package that the cabinet had so far agreed. When the opposition parties rejected it, Henderson thought the government should then resign with their heads held high. The cuts would then come from a conservative administration with liberal backing. If the cuts were to come anyway, why should it be the Labour Party that has to carry them out at such great political cost? Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald's views were precisely the opposite. As the days of meetings had gone on without agreement, confidence had slipped further, and the situation was becoming critical. MacDonald saw it as his duty as Prime Minister and the Labour Cabinet's duty as the government to meet the crisis head-on rather than run away and let the other clean up the mess. MacDonald had built up the Labour Party into the second party of the state, a genuine alternative to the Tories. His whole life work had come to fruition in proving Labour capable of governing. Surely to run away would destroy all that, prove their enemies were right in saying Labour wasn't fit to govern. As MacDonald saw it, Labour were the government of the nation as a whole, not just for their voters and supporters, not just a government for the working class and trade unions. This was their chance to prove it. He wrote in his diary on the 21st of August, quote, "If we yield now to the TUC, we shall never be able to call our bodies or souls or intelligences our own." Furthermore, he sincerely believed that working-class interests would be better served by saving the pound and British finance, because to do otherwise could lead to a total collapse that would hit the poorest hardest. At 10 a.m. on the morning of the 21st of August, MacDonald met the cabinet in fighting mood, following the disappointments of the previous day, determined to persuade his colleagues to agree to a program that would balance the budget, win the confidence of the opposition, and thus save the pound and keep the second Labour government in office. First, Snowden informed the cabinet of the TUC's position, their radical proposals, and their opposition to the government's policy. The Labour cabinet did not share the view of the unions, the cabinet minutes dryly recording, quote, "It was agreed that it would be necessary to inform the General Council of the TUC that the government regretted that there was no alternative to their program." MacDonald and Snowden appear to have acted cleverly here in preventing the TUC's rebellion from instantly spreading to the cabinet. For the famous socialist intellectual Sidney Webb, the government's colonial minister, said of the meeting, quote, "The General Council are pigs. They won't agree to any cuts of unemployment benefits or salaries or wages. JRM, MacDonald, has behaved in all good faith over the whole business." Then, MacDonald presented the latest advice from the Bank of England, which was gloomy, saying the position was worsening and that the American banks would still not lend to the British government, and that if they announced a program that the financial markets found to be inadequate, it would have, quote, "a most detrimental effect." Nevertheless, the cabinet meeting, which lasted more than 5 hours, utterly failed in its task. MacDonald and Snowden tried in vain to persuade their colleagues to accept a 10% cut in unemployment benefit, only 11 of the 21 ministers voting in favor. Henderson led the opposition, insisting his premium idea was sufficient. The idea of a revenue tariff was raised for a final time, but now that it was known the Liberals would reject one, the matter was laid to rest. Ministers even managed to haggle down some of the savings, with the cut in teachers' salaries reduced from 20 to 15%. The majority of the cabinet supported suspending the sinking fund, as the TUC had suggested, despite Snowden's bitter opposition. By the end of the meeting, all that had been agreed was £56.4 million worth of cuts, a measly increase on the £56.25 million accepted by the Cabinet on the 19th, and £22 million short of the Cabinet Economy Committee's original proposals the opposition had believed not gone far enough. MacDonald was instructed by his colleagues to communicate the outcome of the Cabinet to the Bank and the opposition and recall Parliament. It seemed this was Labour's final word on the matter, and the fate of the government was therefore sealed. There was no way this package would pass through Parliament, and the government would be forced from office. Most of the ministers then left London for the weekend, believing their work complete. When MacDonald and Snowden left the cabinet meeting, however, events took a drastic turn. They were distraught at the outcome of the cabinet, but things were about to get worse. Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, Sir Ernest Harvey, and his colleague, Edward Peacock, saw the Prime Minister and Chancellor as soon as the cabinet broke up. The bankers told the Labour leaders that the situation was now desperate. They could hold out for 4 more days, after which the bank's resources would be exhausted. Some sort of announcement would be needed before then if the government was to secure a loan and sterling was to be saved. Not only that, but when MacDonald and Snowden told them of the £56.4 million program, the Cabinet's final word, they were horrified. They said the announcement of such an inadequate package would probably make things worse rather than better. It would further undermine confidence in British public finances and make it even less likely that the government would get an American credit. The bankers believed the suspension of the sinking fund would alarm potential investors, and that they would judge the failure to cut the dole and the increased contributions thus required from employers and employees would only further depress British industry. MacDonald, despite having just gone through what David Marquand calls the most harrowing meeting of the week, told Harvey to nevertheless formally request government credits from Paris and New York on the terms the cabinet had agreed, and insisted that the bank not inform the international lenders of the actual £170 million projected deficit and the suspension of the sinking fund. Immediately afterwards, MacDonald and Snowden faced another conference with the opposition leaders, as yesterday, Chamberlain and Hoare for the Conservatives and Samuel and Maclean for the Liberals. Unsurprisingly, given they had rejected £78 million on the 20th as insufficient, the opposition parties labelled the final proposals of £56 million worth of cuts as derisory, and derided the injustice that the unemployed would be spared the sacrifices made by every other section of the community in the form of both salary cuts and, of course, very substantial tax rises. MacDonald and Snowden said they agreed, but that their colleagues would go no further. The £56 million was the last word. The Bank of England had informed the opposition figures about the 4-day deadline, so the conference clearly had something of a crisis atmosphere. Someone then asked what would happen if the announcement of their package failed to restore international confidence. Snowden grimly replied, "The deluge." Understandably, Samuel Hoare protested loudly at this answer. According to Chamberlain's diary, MacDonald then asked, jokingly, Quote, "Well, are you prepared to join the board of directors?" Hoare replied, quote, "If seriously made, it was a proposition which would demand serious consideration." Samuel then suggested the opposition withdraw to confer, and it was agreed that they would return to Downing Street later that evening. They also said the king must be consulted. Essentially, they were saying that one way or another, there would have to be a change of government. The prospect of a national government, an all-party coalition, had therefore been raised, although no commitments yet made. There had been talk of a national government for many months in the face of the Depression, and given the fact there was a hung parliament. An editorial in the Times had discussed the possibility in early August in response to the May report, but suggested it unlikely due to the differences over tariffs between the Liberals and Conservatives and the fact the majority of the Labour Party would likely object to the May Committee's recommendations. Although suggested in a joking way, MacDonald had brought up one possible route out of the crisis, given the Labour government clearly could not now survive, but that a solution was needed in a matter of days before Parliament could be recalled to pass a no-confidence motion. Nevertheless, it still appeared at this stage that a Conservative minority administration with Liberal support would be the most likely outcome. With events moving quickly, MacDonald now attempted to recall the Labour cabinet to inform them of the 4-day deadline. However, many ministers had left London or could not be found, and at 6:15 p.m. the Prime Minister told the colleagues he had in front of him that a special cabinet would have to be held at 9:30 a.m. the next day, Saturday the 22nd of August. At 9:30 p.m., the opposition leaders returned to Downing Street and saw MacDonald, Snowden, and Thomas. Chamberlain seems to have dominated the meeting, effectively speaking for the whole opposition. He wrote in his diary that, quote, "I opened first and intimated, 1, that if these, the £56.4 million spending cuts, were the final proposals, we should turn them out immediately. 2, before then, we anticipated the financial crash must come. 3, that we considered that it was the Prime Minister's bounden duty to avoid that crash, and 4, that we were ready to give him any support in our power for that purpose, either with his present or in a reconstructed government." In effect, if Parliament was in session, the opposition would have removed the Labour government, but given this could not be effected before a financial collapse, some other solution was needed. Samuel then said much the same thing for the Liberals before MacDonald replied, according to Chamberlain's diary, quote, "In reply, the PM began by drawing a touching picture of his own position, a thing he loves to do. He had founded, nursed, cherished, built up the Socialist Party. It was painful enough to leave an old party. What must it be for him to contemplate killing his own child? He did not think resignation would help. He would remain PM, assert his own views, invite his colleagues to support him, and tell those who would not that they might go, quote, where they liked." Sir Samuel Hoare's impression was that Snowden and Thomas were supportive of Chamberlain's suggestions, but that MacDonald was more reticent, that he had, quote, decided to resign and to advise the king to send for the party leaders for consultations as to the next step. That next step could, of course, be a national government, but it could also be a conservative one. Nothing, therefore, was decided on the night of the 21st of August. The situation remained critical and unclear. Despite all the frustrations of the previous few days, however, the main effect of the meeting on MacDonald was a reinforced determination to save the Labour government. He was decided that given the stance of the opposition parties and given the 4-day deadline, he might at last be able to persuade the cabinet tomorrow morning to agree to a sufficient economy program. Failing that, he could sound out his colleagues about the possibility of a national government. The weekend would see the Labour Civil War and the ticking clock of the coming deluge combine with dramatic consequences. Thanks so much for watching episode 7 of The Crisis. If you enjoyed it, please consider dropping a like because it really helps us out. And if you're not already, remember to subscribe to never miss another episode. As well as that, we'd like to thank our patrons, including our executive producers, Eustace Abel, Jeremy Marcoux, Tom McCool, and Tony Churin for helping to support the show. Thanks so much, and see you in the next episode.